Hi, today I'll be covering the changes to combat balance for Blackwood, including some class and specific ability changes that we recently learned about in the patch notes. So I'll skip most of the general bug fixes that took up a big chunk of the read through and just cover the actual balance changes. I did my full patch note review over on Twitch, but instead of uploading that here, I'll be breaking down the notes into specific sections, which I'll post different videos on. So this will be my YouTube version of the patch note review, but a little more organized instead of an initial reaction video. And I'll have links to the other sections of it down in the description if you're interested in those. So for this video, I'll first go through the class changes and then the ability changes, and then we'll end with some general combat balance changes. All right, let's get into it. So first off with Dragon Knights, not a whole lot here, just some cost reduction to the coagulating blood morph of Dragon Blood. Still holding out for some stam DK love at this point, but I wasn't expecting a whole lot of class balance stuff this patch. Next up we have Necromancers. Boneyard got a slight tweak to the time it lasts down to 10 seconds from 10.5, and the synergy now scales with the activator. So I honestly thought the synergy already scaled with the activator like most synergies do, so I guess this is more of a bug fix than anything else. And then a pretty decent nerf here, the crit chance in the Death Knell passive was reduced to 4% per Gravelord ability, down from 10%. This is probably a good thing overall. Necromancers were outperforming other classes by a decent bit, and with all the recent nerfs to crit chance, they still got to sit easily at 100% crit chance throughout execute. So Necromancers will still be very strong and one of the best classes, so don't fret too much if that's what you're mostly playing. And then there was a small change to the Agony Totem as well to only hit 6 people at once. For Nightblades, not a lot here, but Dark Cloak did get a small nerf, reducing the healing on it by 5%. For Sorcerers, just a couple of small changes to the way abilities work here. The ultimate negate will tick twice as hard but at half the frequency, so about the same damage overall. And Mage's Fury, the Sorc Execute, received a small damage buff due to changing the way it ranked up. Next up is Templar. They received the most changes overall. The Luminous Shards morph of Spear Shards will now give back both Stam and Mag equally, so a small buff there to differentiate from the other morph and from Orbs as well. Living Dark was buffed to now scale with either max health or spell damage, so this will now allow tanks to have an additional tool for an incoming heal as they're being attacked. And the devs commented that this was due to their lacking of many tools for the tank role. So sticking with tank related changes, Rune Focus went through a bit of a rework as well. Instead of adding extra armor while standing inside the room, this adds extra healing now. It still gives the major resolve though for 59-48 armor. The Magicka morph will now last 25 seconds instead of 20, and the Stamina morph will provide increased healing. I imagine the Stamina morph is what more tanks will use to be able to restore stamina while blocking and always have a heal over time. Pretty cool change overall, I think. Some people might miss that additional armor, but generally we can get tanky enough on our tanks without it, so having a way to get a little extra incoming healing should be pretty nice. There was also a small change to the synergy from Ritual. It used to have a negative effect present before you could activate it. Now the synergy can be activated at any time. So this should be nice to provide a nice reliable synergy for sets that require synergy activation, such as Alkosh. In the Ultimate, Nova went through some changes as well. The synergy stun will last a little longer, and there's no longer a cap on the number of enemies that it can hit. So the Gravity Crush morph had its damage increased, but the size slightly reduced to 8 meters instead of 10. And then the other morph, Solar Disturbance, now is at a reduced cost and applies a longer duration of Major Maim. The tooltip in-game actually says 12 seconds for the duration here on this morph, so I'm not sure if the patch notes one or this one is the accurate one. They don't quite line up there. And then for Wardens, we don't have much here, just a nerf to the Arctic Wind heal. This was a really strong heal for high health builds, so it should still be really good, I think, even with the nerf. Alright, now we'll go on to the ability changes. First, let's look at the new bleed damage ability. So last patch, they introduced the status effect Hemorrhage, which has a chance to proc from bleed abilities. The chance varies by source, like all other status effects, so it would be 20% chance from weapon enchants, 10% from single target direct damage abilities, 5% from AoE direct damage abilities, 3% from damage over time abilities, and 1% chance from area of effect damage over time abilities. So the issue we ran into was that no abilities in the game existed for those top 3 conditions, so the best chance we had to proc it from any ability was 3%. So it was usually around like 500 DPS or less that it contributed. So I think the idea was with these changes, we'll have a little bit better chance to proc it than before. So first up with Bloodthirst, this is the opposite morph of Rapid rapid strikes. So with this ability hitting 5 times in rapid succession, it should be the best of all of these as far as chance to proc hemorrhage, with it having a 10% chance from each of its 5 hits within that 0.6 second duration. I think with that, this morph should also now be the stronger morph of the two for damage as well, so might need to see some kind of adjustment to the rapid strikes morph, since this bloodthirst morph gets healing also with it. Carve, the opposite morph of Brawler, will also deal bleed damage now, so now even more of a choice between a big shield or damage between the two morphs. Cutting Dive, the Stamwarden Spamble, will now deal direct bleed damage, and then the Werewolf ability Pounce will have its upfront damage also count as bleed damage. Trap Beast in both of its morphs will have both the initial hit and the dot it leaves behind count as bleed damage. And then finally, Twin Slashes in both of its morphs will count as bleed damage. So Twin Slashes is 2 hits on that initial hit with each cast as well, so it will have a slightly higher chance to proc hemorrhage, but not quite as good of a chance as Bloodthirst. So overall, I like this direction. It did make a lot of sense to have a status effect that could barely be activated, so now we should see a little more damage from hemorrhage for those that build into it. Alright, next is a change to Deadly Cloak. Instead of ticking once every second for 10 seconds, it will now tick every other second like the base morph, but at double the damage. This doesn't look so bad at first glance, and it's fine if you're using it as a front bar ability, but for cases where you're using dual wield on the back bar and using Deadly Cloak to keep up your enchantments, this is going to be a bit of a nerf. The way that back bar enchantments work is that they alternate back and forth when you have a dual wield back bar. They don't activate at the same time. So with this ticking every 1 second, it perfectly kept up your back bar enchantments, as they would just alternate back and forth and each one would tick every 2 seconds. Well now, since this ability only ticks every 2 seconds and the enchantments can't activate at the same time, it effectively cuts those enchantments in half, since now they'll only trigger every 4 seconds. It also behaves awkwardly with a weapon damage enchant, which when infused lasts for 5 seconds with the same cooldown of 5 seconds. However, since Deadly Cloak now only ticks every other second, so it's going to be on 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and 6 seconds, it doesn't refresh when it runs out, but instead has to wait an extra second. So it'll only have a 5 out of 6 second uptime now. So I really hope that they do something to address this, because it is a bit awkward and doesn't make a lot of sense that dual wield back bar should get less effectiveness from their enchantments than other back bar options. Alright, moving on to axes. They got a little bit of a buff, both the one-handers and the two-handers. They will now be 6% crit damage for each one-handed and 12% crit damage for each two-handed axe. And they'll no longer boost your crit healing, so not sure how this will affect the meta. I still think daggers will be the best in most setups. For some really high crit chance setups, especially with mechanical acuity, I could see axes maybe passing up swords now, but we'll need to test it a little bit more, since weapon and spell damage from swords will also boost proc sets now. So I'll be digging into this one a little more as the PTS goes on. The two-handed skill Brawler got a little bit of a buff to the shield size, but probably won't be too noticeable overall. And then this one's pretty big. Mystic Orb had its damage brought down by a fair bit. Instead of ticking every half second, it will now tick once every second, but the damage was boosted a little bit to make it not quite as drastic as being cut in half. So it should be about roughly 58% of its former value. They did also decrease the travel speed, so it may get more ticks in on some smaller enemies that didn't receive the full duration because it moved by too fast before. But overall, definitely a decent sized nerf. However, this skill was pretty overperforming in the past, so even with the big nerf, it should still definitely be worth running. It's still a great AoE dot. They also adjusted the healing version as well. Since it will tick less often now, they boosted the heals on it by 38%, and it will move more slowly through the group. And then finally for the skills, Caltrops. They buffed the damage of Caltrops by 36%. Previously, it was not given the normal damage of an AoE damage over time ability, but they are now attempting to buff it to a usable level. Caltrops was mostly just used for the major breach debuff it gave on the Razor Caltrops morph, since the damage was not very good on it. So with this buff, that use will be a little bit better. However, just using it as a dot in your rotation looks just okay right now. A little bit lacking overall, especially when compared to the even nerfed version of Mystic Orb. You can see here on this Stamina Nightblade parse that it barely does more than Twisting Path, which is a Magicka ability that doesn't scale with stamina based stats, and Twisting Path's max tick was actually higher. Now Twisting Path and some other class AoE dots do have intentionally higher values than regular AoE dots, but I don't know, Mystic Orb is still going to do close to double the damage of this for Magicka DPS. I'd like to see it get a little bit more of a boost to put it on par with Orb, but it's still early in the PTS, so we'll see where it ends up. Alright, and then finally, there were a few general combat changes as well that I'll quickly go through. So Battle Spirit now includes health recovery reduction. So health recovery is usually a stat built for in PvP and can be pretty powerful there. So they're now including that in the same way that healing is included, and all the values are cut in half. Minor Lifesteal and Magicka Steel were slightly altered, but will still mostly function in the same way. The healing done from them will scale with the caster though, and the healing taken and crit chance with the receiver of the effect. And I think the last line here is just saying that you won't be able to use something like Alter with Lifesteal to proc secondary effects, like Spell Power Cure or other sets that work off heals. And then finally, they reduced the group size allowance to 12 people total, even outside of Cyrodiil and Trials. So I'm not sure how much this will really affect things, maybe Dolmen farming groups, but I don't think groups this large were too common outside of Cyrodiil anyways. Alright, that's going to do it for this one. I think there's some pretty good stuff here, but would like to see some tweaks to it in the coming weeks of the PTS. Big thanks to my current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to know how you can help support the channel, I'll have it linked in the description below. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, and Privy League Guild on PlayStation's European server. I appreciate y'all stopping by. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.